How would you value an Android user in India? Hey everyone, I'm here today with Robin to do a PMM mock interview. Before we jump into the interview, Robin, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Robin. I'm a product manager at Google and previously product marketing manager at Google.
Today, we're going to be answering the question, how would you value an Android user in India? Now, when we go through this question, I'd like us to first talk about sort of like the LTV calculation and sort of the strategy behind it. And then later, I would like us to get into the part where we discuss the actual number for at least one revenue stream for an Android user in India.
Great. That sounds like a really fun question. So I'm specifically calling out two main things: the value or Android user lifetime value and India. What lifetime value actually means, just to clarify the question first. Would you say that it means it's like basically like a function of annual revenue per user times by length of lifetime, or like average length of lifetime?
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct?
Yep, that's right.
Great,
yeah.
Great. So the way that I would think about this first is ultimately thinking about like the average revenue per user and what would be the main drivers for the revenue per user for Android. So I know that Google owns Android, so I need to think probably more holistically of how it could be beneficial for the overall Google. So thinking like a few revenue streams for me that come to mind are: how does Google make money? It makes money through search ads, like ads on search. It makes money through Play Store revenue. If you actually kind of buy apps on Android, I think it takes a percentage, like a 30% cut or something like that. And also like videos, right? So like apps, like films, like also I think there's some subscriptions and audiobooks as well they have. And also I was thinking about like YouTube as well, so that I know there's like ads on YouTube. So for example, like that's also how they make money. Another way I think they make money is through like there are different versions of like Drive and Gmail for businesses. So like, I don't know, Enterprise. They also make money through hardware, like the Pixel phones, Nest, Google Home. And there's also, I think, some like more services that are related to hardware. Like I think I've heard of this thing called Google One, where you can like buy storage on your Google Photos and stuff like that. So there's a bunch of these, there are so many different revenue streams, but I think what I should try and do is pick one and really focus on one. And especially considering it's like India, I don't think, and ultimately thinking about like what could be the biggest revenue driver for Google. I know that like Google doesn't make as much money right now on hardware. So I'll probably rule out that. Also like enterprise, how is this related to an Android user? It's more like consumer and like business, that's kind of separate. So I'm going to rule out that. I know, so between Play Store search and YouTube, I know that YouTube makes quite a lot of money, but maybe not as much. Like I think they actually released that it makes something on the ground, like around 15 billion or something like that. But so that's a lot. But considering it's India, maybe there aren't as many YouTube users in India, because there's like higher bandwidth. Generally, I think like search ads and Play Store make more money than YouTube, so probably not. So now diving specifically into search ads and Play Store, I would say Play Store makes quite a lot of money for countries with a higher disposable income and like people who like pay money for games and like films and other things. And I don't think India is as much of that market. I think somewhere like Korea and Japan are versus India. So I think search ads is the best part to prioritize.
Got it. And just a quick follow up there. So what about the length of the lifetime of the user? Like, are we calculating that into this? How does that
Yeah.
play into any of this?
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. I would like we can maybe we can touch upon that now, address that now, and then jump into the annual revenue per user.
Sure, whichever order makes sense.
Yeah, I think the average length of lifetime actually would probably be a quicker to estimate. So what the average length of lifetime would be is basically what is the average length of the lifetime of an Android user? Like what's the average length of lifetime of a phone user itself? And most people upgrade cycles, it's between like 2 to 4 years. In India, because the annual income is more on the lower side versus like say the US, it's probably going to be slightly longer lifetime cycles. So I could probably estimate somewhere between like 3 to 4 years, 3.5 years, to make that easier. That being said, there's probably like a degree of churn for every year. So for example, from 1 year to the next year, there could be people could move from Android, say, to iPhone, or they could move to like, I don't know, a different OS, like a Samsung OS, or like a Microsoft OS, if it still exists. But I can imagine that degree of churn is probably lower in a place like India than, because it's just the Android dominance is pretty significant.
Got it.
Cool. So I'm gonna wipe out this board quickly and speak to
The search ads.
search ads.
Okay, great. That sounds great.
So search ads, ads revenue per user. Okay. So now I like, ideally I want to try and find a number for the revenue per user per year for Android, so for search ads.
Got it. And for those watching, we're now in sort of the estimation part of this question. So now I'd like us to actually come to a number about what we've discussed so far.
Perfect. So the way that I think about revenue per user is ultimately what is the function of revenue in ads. It's ultimately like the number of clicks on the ad times by the cost per click. And then how would we actually figure the number of clicks on an ad? The way that we would figure that out is per user per year. The way that I'd figure that out is ultimately like the number of sessions per user per year, and then a percentage of ad clicks per session. And then we could like kind of, in terms of the number of sessions per user per year, we could get that down into like more granular detail, like how many sessions per day, and then times that by a multiple. So I wanted to like sketch this out before we kind of dig deep into the actual specific details. Do you have any questions?
No, this makes sense. Yeah. Can you just repeat it so that we can just each of the names? Yeah.
Yeah. So revenue per user, number of clicks on ad per user per year, number of sessions per user per year times by the percentage of ad clicks per session. And then, of course, like the cost per click itself, the average cost per click.
Got it.
One thing, yeah.
Go
So
ahead.
one thing I'm assuming here is like, there's this thing called fill rate, which basically means like whether all of the ad spots get filled. So this is assuming that all of the ad spots get filled. So like whenever Google has an ad spot in its auction inventory, that always gets filled. So one of and yeah, like what I would love to do actually to kind of estimate that and see whether that assumption is correct is if I could get that data in the product itself. Like I know there's an ad auction mechanism at Google. Like could I see what the percent, like what the average fill rate is? Is it close to 100%? Is it not? So as we mentioned, number of sessions per user per year. So could I estimate the number of sessions per user per week first? That would make more sense. Or even per day, let's say per day. So how many times does the average person in India on Android search per day? So I would say, and this is interesting because the value of the Android user, what we're really thinking about here is how much do they search more than the average iOS user or the average like other non-Android user. So given that I know Android is specifically developed to make searching more easy. So there's an Android quick search bar where you can actually search directly from the home screen.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like more conducive to search more. But like how much more? That's what I'm trying to calculate. So on a daily basis, the number of times that I search a lot. I probably search like maybe like 100 times a day. And I can imagine that maybe like an equivalent iOS user or like non-iOS or like non-Android user probably searches like 10% less than me. Or like, yeah, 10% is just like a proxy. So maybe that's like 10 searches per day more. 10 searches per day more than iOS or alternative. Another thing is to mention is when you're on iOS or when you're another operating system, you could be using other search engines, right? So how many Google searches specifically do you use more, and how much does that equal to for the whole year? 10 times by 360, like 350, let's just say roughly. So that's like 3,500. So what is the percentage of ad clicks per session? And I think that's like roughly 1 to 5%, just generally like click-through rates. I know ads are at the higher end, but I also know that like there's a certain percentage that Google decides to monetize and doesn't monetize. Like for example, like it won't monetize on like certain illicit quick like searches. So let's just say like 2% get 2% of sessions get an ad click.
Got it.
Okay, so what's the number of clicks on the ad per user per year? So that's 2% times by 3.5, which is 3.5 times by 2 is 7. Divide that by 1,000. That's roughly 70 clicks on the ad per user per year.
Got it.
So now I get to the CPC, the cost per click, and this really does vary a lot depending on like what type of search it is. Basically, like if it's like a travel type search, like if you're looking for a holiday, you're probably going to be monetized more, like anywhere between like it could even be as high as like $50. But given it's India, it's probably going to be on the lower range because generally advertising is a bit cheaper there. So I would estimate it to be anywhere between $1 to $5. So on average, that's probably like around $2. The average cost per click. So given that 2 times 70 is $140 dollars per user. So kind of taking that back and kind of going back to the overall question, And by the way, just to jump in here, I could actually get a lot of this data and validate this data and these assumptions through logs, through kind of in product feedback, through the actual data that we would get in Google search. And you can use this comparison basically by kind of maybe doing an experiment with how many searches you're getting from Android versus iOS or other operating systems to determine that. Okay, so we said $140 per revenue per user, and then to get the overall lifetime value, I would see what is that overall kind of, out of all the other kind of contributing factors, how much of the lifetime value or the revenue overall is related to ads or search ads versus YouTube ads or Play Store. I would assume that this is probably like 90%. So if I was to add another 10%, it would be what, $150 roughly, $154 per user, and then I would times that by the lifetime value, which we times that by the lifetime of the user, which we said was 3 years roughly. So that would equal to $450 overall for a number.
Awesome. Well, we came to an actual number. Before we close and wrap and add for feedback, I'd love to just get a sense of where do you think your number is wrong? Like we just did a lot of calculations, back of the math calculation. What would you be cautious of, or what key elements do you think might be worth tweaking?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say in this whole kind of, there's the biggest dependency I would see here is probably from the user component side. Like how many users would actually kind of get to like the number of clicks that we would get, and ultimately like the number of sessions per user, because I think that's the biggest margin of error. Because if we see that like there's 5 more searches per day, or like even like 2 more searches per day per Android user, this number dwindles down significantly. Whereas like if we were just to tweak the percentage of ad clicks per session much, like I think the error bars there are less significant, right? Like I don't think it's going to go, and I don't think it's going to go as low as like 0.1, because ultimately the ad is actually at the top of the page. It's more kind of prominent. So I would say definitely more like the user driven behavior for like the number of searches than anything else.
Got it. Okay, that's helpful just to get a sense of. Okay, awesome. Well, Robin, let's wrap that there. You can take a deep breath, unless there's anything else you wanted to add to the interview. Is there any other elements? Okay, great. Well, let's do a little bit of feedback on, I just took a bunch of notes on what I thought you did really well about this interview. But before I jump into that, did you have any self-reflection or things that you wanted to cover before I cover my feedback?
Yeah, so the point I added in around how I'd get to that data, I could have probably added that earlier in the case. So even like, for example, when we kind of were prioritizing between search, Play Store, and other revenue streams, I could have actually mentioned, okay, I could actually use that data, and specifically, how is it different in India? I think I missed that point, like more so. Okay, how is this India specific, and where can I bring the India related insights and how that might change versus say in the US or Europe, etc.
Got it. Yeah, I think that's a great point. Let me just go into some of the feedback that I wrote, and then we can talk more broadly if there's any other thoughts or comments. So a few things I think you did really effectively on this interview. One thing I think you did really well is that you brainstormed the list of possible revenue streams, and it was more of a divergent exercise. You're sort of thinking, okay, what are possible revenue streams? Like, did I think of them all? And it's that broad, you're going broad, and then you're picking one and going deep on it. I thought that was really effective in terms of showing that you had the breadth of knowledge, and then you actually reasoned about why you picked the one that you picked, and then went for it. That was great. It was clear you had knowledge before. You had done research on the company, and just advice to those watching, do research on your company. You should know, especially, especially for a company like Google, where you have ads as the main business driver. It's really important to understand how the ad business works before you go into that interview. You estimated with justification every step of the way. Even if you came up with kind of a weird number or you weren't sure about it, at least you provided a justification. And that alone is really effective in estimation interviews. Otherwise, you're just shooting in the dark and it seems like you just made up the number. At least you had some basis. Um, I thought your whiteboarding was super effective. Like the diagram you have currently on the screen was, because we could just literally see you go in, you broke down all the components into the little components, and then you popped back up and you kind of showed how all solving for all those X, Y, Z's brought you back to the solving the overall equation. And that was just a great visual tool for me to understand where you were in that. Um, and then I thought you also did an effective job in, especially in these market sizing questions, mentioning edge cases is also really helpful. So you mentioned the fill rate, for example, which is really effective because, you know, there's all these things that could be wrong with this model, you know, and just mentioning at least a couple of those things actually is really, really helpful to show the interviewer that you're thinking of them, but you know that it might not be worth the time to discuss. I thought you also just like, the mentioning of your own data, like how you'd get that data yourself, was effective. I agree you could have put that a little earlier in the interview, but I thought still bringing that up, it was super effective because it's not only that, you know, you could estimate it, but it's like, here's how I would actually get the number if I were actually getting it. And then, yeah, I think there's probably something there about being a little more India specific, being a little more maybe like Android specific, things like that. So given that the users in India, sort of the way it came up was a lot of like, oh, it's on the lower end of the spectrum, or it might be on this side. And then maybe just speaking to, you know, oh, there's more Android users in India, so there might be this effect or something like that. Just kind of weaving that in when you can. And for those watching, it's not an expectation that you'll understand the demographic of the Indian population of users, but just maybe having some hints or some ideas of how you would go about it or some hypotheses to test might be helpful. But overall, really effective, Robin, really great job. This is really helpful and educational and valuable. And for those of you watching, good luck on your upcoming interview.
Good luck.